Okay, when you are working on 1-point perspective, one of the first things that you need to do is secure your drawings, because normally I want the paper to be mobile. I want to be able to turn the page as I draw. But in this case, I want the ruler to be mobile and I want the paper to be stable. So I'm going to make sure that the drawing is attached to my work surface, and then I can move freely with the ruler and not worry about the drawing moving. All right, so when I am designing 1-point perspective, I simply set a horizon. It's usually not in the middle of the page. To be naturalistic, it should be, kind of in the upper part of the page. And there are limitations to where the viewpoint can be, right? Now it's it can be in the middle. Imagine you're looking right down an avenue, and it can be a little to the left or the right. That means you're kind of, to the side and turning, right? Something like that. But it could not be over here, because that doesn't make sense. If something is over here, that's not 1-point perspective anymore. That is really definitely 2-point. So, and also when you're making 2-point perspective, you could have a point here. If you have 1 point on, the other point has to be off, right? That's the only way it makes sense. So I'm going to choose but for this assignment, we're just doing 1-point perspective. So I just choose the middle, and I basically just add whatever construction lines I want, just because I'm not quite sure what I'm drawing yet. Now for this assignment, okay, great. Just something like that. That is pretty much right. Now, what you want to do is just think about your the schema that we've been working with, and try to, don't actually draw a city scene or anything like that. Don't draw something that you've observed, but just think about repeating a pattern and making it go backwards in space, right? And I'm going to show you exactly how to do this. I think maybe what I need is, maybe that's a little too broad. These are not perfectly aligned, because I don't care. Because in my experience, I know that intuitive perspective and having those internal rules is way more powerful than rigid work with a ruler. All right, so let's say we're going to make a repeating form. So this is what we're looking for in this assignment, that you can repeat something, even though it's an abstract object, and send it backwards in space, right? So I don't know what I'm going to draw here, but I know that I want it to take up a vaguely square position, right? So I'm using my intuition, and I'm sort of saying, I think, it's not what I normally think of as a square is kind of like that, but I just have to interpret knowing that this line is shorter, right? Okay. I have this great transparent ruler, so I can make sure that my work is exactly aligned. All right, so that is my intuitive sense of what a square is, right? Now, the question is, how do I take this exact proportion and push it back into space? The way that I do that is using the diagonal. So I'm pretty sure that's a square. I add the diagonal, and, you know, just for fun, I can add the next diagonal. And so the exact center of the square, right? Now just look at that for a minute. See how this is the exact center of the square, but it's counterintuitive. In the exact center of a square, I know exactly where to put it, right? It's right there, but I can see really clearly that there's a lot more space here. There's a ton more space here than there is here. This is way shorter, right? So how do I progress this back into space? So now this is where a transparent ruler is really essential, but just do your best if you don't have a transparent ruler. So see, I'm aligning with this diagonal right here. Then I keep that alignment, and I go back to that corner. I connect to that corner with my ruler while aligning with this diagonal, right? Okay, so that is more or less on. Cool. And now that I have that point, that's that intersection. So now I can align this horizontal line, and oops, I need a little space there. Cool. Right? So these two squares have the exact same proportion. And let's just do a series of at least 3 or 4. All right, if you don't have a transparent ruler, please don't let that stop you from doing this. Just do your best with whatever you have. Even if you have to, I mean, you could essentially do it without a ruler, right? Like you could just go, okay, this is the same. You could cut a little piece of paper, and line it up. You could use your intuition. You could just do your best, right? But something in a way that's even better. If you're not relying on a ruler, if you're just sort of, if you're just able to make those diagonals exactly the same, that will make you way more effective in doing these progressions, right? All right, so now I can line it up with the horizontal. And remember, in atmospheric perspective, things just get indistinct as they go back. So these are, these units, you probably see maybe 4 of them, and that's it, right? So now I'm going to try to freehand one. That's pretty much right. That diagonal is parallel. Cool. Right, so now I have 4 units going back into space, and I think that's pretty much right. But I think that it's also really, really interesting to continue it forward in space too. All right, so there's my final one. This is one of those counterintuitive things, like when you're, when you know the top surface of something, of one of your schema is square, you always want to draw a square, always, and so it's always going to be hard for you to make a compressed surface like that. It's always going to be hard, right? So just know that. And one of the other things that's always going to be hard for you is knowing how this progression works, right? This progression is always going to be counterintuitive. If you start with a box that's this size, and you know in your mind that you want to progress the same size box backwards, you're always going to make a mistake where you accidentally make it the same size. It is impossible for you to know how to progress it to be smaller and smaller accurately, unless you practice and get to the point where you train yourself and force it to be intuitive, right? Now I've seen student assignments. I think this is pretty much right. I think my intuition on this is pretty good. But I've seen student assignments where back here, you take this box, you put it back here, and it's still this big, right? And the student is like, oh, what's wrong? I don't understand. That makes total sense to me. See how that looks correct in terms of the perspective, but it's not correct in terms of the length. And the only way that you can know that is if you engineer these diagonals, and if you sort of follow up on those diagonals build those diagonals into your intuition and practice it, right? Now, here's the other thing that I think I'm just fascinated with is that this center, when the square is compressed like this, it's bigger in the front, it's shorter in the back. So the center isn't in the center, it's back a little bit, right? So there is one of your exercises, like compressing a rectangle backwards in space. And then let's do this exact same thing with circles. Okay, so I'm just going to reassert this line because it's a little bit light. I'm going to just try my best to make a square. That's what I want to work with, right? Or actually for this one, let's imagine that we have a vertical surface here, right? I think that's a little better. Okay, there's my vertical surface. You can make it exactly vertical by lining up your ruler with the edge of the page. And my intuition was pretty much right. Now I'm going to intuit a square. You know, see how I want to do this? See what I mean? Because this length is the same as this length, but it's not that. You have to think about distance, and you have to get the feeling of going back in space. So I think an actual square is kind of more like this. And then I'm using this line, by the way. I know I made two. So I can actually discover it by doing a diagonal. But I'm going to try to intuit it, and then I'm going to check with the diagonal and see if I was right. Okay, so what I'm thinking, I think that this surface area is exactly equal to this one. I think that's pretty much right. So I'm going to use this as the master diagonal. And then I'm going to align my ruler in such a way that I can parallel that diagonal and also meet that corner. Okay. So, I'm proud of myself. That's beautiful. Those are exactly parallel. So I know that this is projected exactly right. So in this case, I'm going to use, I'm just going to use my intuitive perspective. One thing I always tell myself as I'm doing this is that I know that I will think these squares are bigger than they are. So I sort of do what I think, and then I make them a little bit smaller than I want to, than is comfortable. If you think of adding atmospheric perspective to this, you're talking about things becoming indistinct, as they go back. So make sure to make a mental note of that. Another thing about atmospheric perspective is you're talking about, color changing as it goes back. So if this is really distance, then this is black, then this is maybe black. I mean, it's a simplification in terms of color. That's black, that's gray, and this is white, right? It has to be that way, or some version of that. You can show it with your materials. You can show it however you do it. Now I'm gonna continue to check myself, and I'm gonna just sort of line up this ruler and see. Ooh, see, that's not quite right. Now in this case, I made it a little bit less than it should be, maybe. But then you also have to think of, think of the threshold. The threshold is like, everyone knows that a drawing is not real, and everyone kind of suspends their disbelief and looks at a drawing, and is it close enough to correct that it'll be acceptable? And the answer is pretty much yes, right? Like, the original line I had here maybe should have been here. It doesn't matter, right? And whatever gives you more enjoyment, this is parallel. I have the power to intuit it. If you rely more on your intuition, you feel more powerful and you'll enjoy the drawing more. All right, so for this side, so I have a sequence of squares, and I'm going to show you how cylinders map onto squares, right? So basically, a cylinder, now we know the base of a cylinder is a circle, and we know that compressed it should be an oval, right? But the center of the cylinder is not in the center of this square, right? Because the weight of the surface area of the square is more forward, so the center of the cylinder is actually pushed back. So you have to learn to draw these circles where, and this is really hard, where just like the square, there's more surface area forward, right? I don't know how to do it. I know how to cross the threshold where, I know how to cross the threshold where it's like mostly right. But basically here, I'm trying to ask myself with this simple rule, I want this to have more surface area in the front and less back here, right? So I want my circle to be front weighted. And then I'm using this as a kind of a map, right? And now I'm just intuiting it. I want my circle to be front weighted or oval. I don't know how you would draw this. I mean, this is real, but there's no rule for this except you have to just practice, right? You have to realize that that's the center of the shape, but the circle itself is front weighted, right? Gosh, that's just something that you just have to work on. There's maybe some mathematical model of making these cylinders, but there's just no, it's got to be so complex. I don't know how you could incorporate it into your drawing, right? So there's the center, there's the front weight, and then I can sort of work through some of my regular schema here, right? Okay, so there's the side of the cylinder. Now this is close to the eye line. Here's my eye line. So the top of the cylinder is going to be closed. More closed. And you actually can find out exactly how much if you want to. What that entails is you go to one edge of your cylinder, then you go to, the other edge. Then you sort of draw this, and you'll see that, that the perspective dictates the space that you have to make the top of your cylinder. And once again, the circle is front weighted. Cool. So this is not very dramatic, but we have established like the top of this sequence of cylinders, and then these circles are really obscuring each other, right? The cylinders are really in front of each other, but that's okay. They're all open the same amount, and they all progress the same amount. Cool. Cool. That looks right. So then think about, it's kind of hard. Like let's say we wanted to do some cubic forms here. It kind of sucks because these are all really too close together. So really this is just one long block, right? So here's how to do this part is, and try and do these all around, like do, here's the basis for the cubes. Try some that are up above just to challenge yourself, right? And then try to get as close as you can to saying like, that's a square. I know it would be a square if I could see it straight on. I know that this distance has to be compressed, right? So this distance cannot match this distance. And I know what a square is. I know that this distance and this have to be the same. But the compression, I have an intuitive feeling for the compression. I think that's right. Right? So let's have some things hanging down from the ceiling. Oh, see, I know, I just have a feeling when it's too much. Right? So I know it should be like that. Cool, right? Now, if we were to extrude these shapes and make a row of shapes and they're all squares, they would all be stuck together, so they would just look like a big brick. So I have to sort of carve in and give them some margins, right? Just so that I can see the individual objects. Okay, I'm just doing this intuitively. So these are the bases, the base of these squares, and they're hanging down from the ceiling. Cool. Now, I have to do this, and I have to be careful too, because these are transparent forms that are on top of each other. So this is the front surface. This is above the eye line. So you can see that my rows are kind of messed up here, right? The objects are blocking each other as they would in real life. So in the end, I have to rely on intuitive perspective. I have to have that feeling of it.